I want to welcome Stu from the OCD Stories. Thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I love your podcast. I have listened to it for a really long time. And I know a lot of the parents that I work with have listened to it because they share your episodes all the time. So I think it'd be really cool to flip the microphone and interview you. You know, you've spent so much time interviewing other people to hear more about kind of the inside scoop on what got you started. So I'm wondering if we can begin kind of like you start with your guest, talking a little bit just about your own story, and then we can move into what prompted you to start the OCD Stories.
Yeah, well, thank you for the kind words and for listening, and to the parents that listen as well. So my story, my earliest memory was when I was 7, and it was in America. We went to a family trip to Florida. Is it Disneyland or Disney World? I always get the two mixed up.
Yeah, world.
I always get corrected whenever I'm an American. I tell this story, but it was like the stereotypical English thing. If you're going to go to America 25 odd years ago, it was to Florida and it was to Disney World. We got there, and I remember my dad was sick, and looking back, I think it was just kind of bad plane food and jet lag. But he had to go to the motel to sleep it off. So my mum, my brother, and myself went to, I think it was a Denny's or a Wendy's, one of the two, just for something to eat because we were all tired. And then I remember just suddenly feeling very anxious at the time. You know, being a 7-year-old, I didn't have a word for the feeling I was going through, but heavily anxious, lots of thoughts coming into my head, and the thoughts were repetitive images of this tarantula kind of moving towards my dad while he was sleeping in the motel. And the fear was that he was going to get bitten, he was going to die. And then I was kind of seeing these images as like a premonition. So almost like I was seeing the future. So there was starting to be the guilt of, right, if I don't say something now, and we go back and find my dad and he's dead, I'd never live with myself, etc., etc. I never said anything to my mum, and I don't know why to this day. Maybe it was shame. Maybe there was part of me that thought it was absolutely ridiculous. But we got back. He was fine, obviously. And then the next kind of thing on the same trip was around sharks. So we're in the swimming pool, clear swimming pool water. I would swim from one corner to the other, so like 2 meters in, jump out, get as far away from the water as I could, because as soon as I was in, the thought was there was going to be a shark. It was going to eat me, kill me, even though I could see there was clearly nothing there. And then the couple of times my brother dragged me in the water, he was older than me, stronger than me, and I'd almost have a panic attack because in my head, you know, the world was ending. But so that was kind of the earliest memories. And then as I got older, it kind of morphed into a lot of not quite right, a lot of walking back and forth over door frames, past old paintings, old ornaments, until it felt right, is the easiest way to say it. But the fear was that if I didn't walk past it right, I would be stuck in this kind of parallel dimension. It still sounds weird to me when I talk about it now, but it felt really off and really wrong where I was, and I had to keep going back and forth until it felt right. So if I didn't do that, I still would have been with my family and in the world, but it would have been kind of like Interstellar, where you see all these different dimensions. It was kind of like that. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of harm-based stuff, various counting, tapping as the compulsions to kind of calm that down. And then I went to see a doctor when I was 16. They referred me to the psychiatric services here. I had a couple of assessments, and then I was told at the time that it wasn't severe enough, and I should come back, you know, when it's worse. They recommended me some self-help books, which I'm not against, because some people that can really help them. But like me as a 16-year-old then, I didn't read anything. So trying to get me to read was not going to happen. And anyway, so I kind of struggled for another 10 years. And then I went privately, and that was kind of my therapy journey. But between that 16-year-old me and the sort of 27-year-old me, still a lot of harm-based OCD. We could call it real event or false memory OCD. So that type of stuff came in, and then a lot of relationship OCD all the way, from whenever it was 16 or 18 when I first kind of got into my first relationship to 27, to the point where it took me several attempts to finally propose to my now wife, because every time OCD just got in the way and I couldn't do it. Which included a trip to Scotland where I just couldn't do it, a trip to France where I forgot the ring as well. So it was one thing after another, and yeah, several times I tried breaking it off with her. Luckily, it kind of stuck and got through it, but yeah, and then it still affects me from time to time now, but it's a lot more kind of under control.
Yeah, and it's so interesting how, it started at 7, because I just feel like I hear a lot from lots of different people in different countries, and even in America for sure, that, they're too young to diagnose, or it's not severe, or little kids can't have it. And to me, it's so sad. And even like in the DSM, the onset criteria is so high to me, and it's not what anecdotally I see in my practice. I see it really young. I just think we don't have an eye for it. It's just getting missed. That early detection piece is so absent.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a lot better now. Like I'm now training as a child and adolescent psychotherapist, and the parents we work with, they notice stuff. They know that their kids could do with some intervention, some help. But yeah, back when I was 7, mental health wasn't talked about. The idea of a therapist or psychologist wasn't something people used in their day-to-day lives, unless you were kind of, I guess the image was like a straitjacket. That's at least in my country, or at least how I perceived mental health back then. Whereas now we know that's not the case, and it's far broader. But
yeah. And I don't know. I mean, I only know from my own personal experience, but my daughter is half British, so her whole family is in England. And I know in the early days when I'd go over there and visit, I did feel like there was a stigma still, because they'd be like, well, what do? And I was like, well, I'm a therapist. Oh, and the image that they had, and this was, 16 years ago, but the image of what that meant was kind of insulting. It was like, it was so inaccurate, but we have that in America as well. I think maybe not to the level, but I feel like globally it's changing, which is really uplifting and hopeful.
Yeah, I agree. I think here, if I say I'm a therapist, the thing I've noticed is people go to physiotherapists, or, they don't think psychotherapist. And I think part of them wants to say it, but they kind of hesitate and go physio, as if there's even shame to say.
Yeah, they're like, let's just stay in the physical, right? Yeah, exactly. It's funny you had that shark thing. I had that too as a kid. And swimming was like a nightmare, because I intellectually I knew there were no sharks in the pool, and I liked to swim. But when I'd get into that deep end, I would just have a panic attack, because I was pretty convinced that sharks were going to come out. And it's funny. You don't think that that's a common fear, but I see it a lot in my practice too, with kids afraid of sharks. So
yes, you're like the third person I've spoken to now. So I think it's because it's quite a weird one. No one wants to talk about it.
I'm sure at 7, even you knew, and I know I knew. I didn't mention it to a soul. I didn't even start talking about my anxiety issues until I was in my 40s, pretty recently, but I didn't tell anyone, because I knew that was irrational. And I think that's the worst part, is when it's irrational, but you're still scared, and the fear is still just as extreme. And so, to keep quiet, which is unfortunate, because then you didn't tell your mom. I didn't ever tell my parents anything. And then it's fostering more communication with our kids, so they don't have to hold back.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's dialogue, right?
Yeah.
Having that open conversation.
Yeah, I know. So all 3 of my kids have anxiety and OCD, just because it's just genetically rampant. And hopefully your kids won't have it if you have any kids, but if not, you'll be well equipped. And it's not a death sentence, because I think knowing about it, just being proactive, is just part of our lifestyle here. But I know with my son in particular, who's 10 now, it's taken me quite a few years to get him to tell me these intrusive thoughts, because there's so much stigma. I think even more so for a boy than for my two girls. And even now, like he's just starting to, he'll like want to go sit out in the patio and he'll come right back and he's like, does anyone else want to go out in the patio with me? You know, be night. And he really likes to like breathe the fresh air. And I'll be like, just go sit outside. It's fine. And he's like, do you want to go sit with me? And I'm like, are you having a squishy problem? You know, that's what we call his OCD. And he's like, well, Mom, I think there might be like a killer clown out there. So I know that's irrational, but can you come with me? And so he would never admit that in the past, you know, because that sounds ridiculous. But I think parents can work on it, which is really uplifting.
Absolutely. And I can completely relate to his fear as well. Not the clown part, but the kind of the killer that's hiding sort of.
Oh yeah. We have many hidden killers in our house all the time. You know, and I get it because that was me too. I mean, I lived in hyper arousal my entire childhood. And then it didn't help that we actually had a break-in the middle of the night where I was awake. So I never tell my kids about that because I'm like, that's not going to really help their anxiety. But that just probably was the icing on the cake for me with a reality trauma. So let's talk about what made you go from your own experiences to creating the OCD stories.
Yeah, I've thought about this many times over the years, and I always go to, as part of my recovery, I just wanted to do something. I wanted to kind of like an acceptance commitment therapy. They talk about values and living by your values, and then the kind of other side of that is trying to live a meaningful life. And I think I read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, quite early on, and so I had that stuck in my head. And I kind of had the thought. I remember I was sitting on the edge of my bed where I was flooding with anxiety. At the time, it was heavily around relationships. And I just thought, if I'm going to suffer, then I might as well make someone else's life better because of my suffering. It sounds quite grand, but at the time on the bed, it was just, there's no other joy right now. So I might as well try and find some in this, in serving others. And originally it started off with I was fleshing it out over the following week, and unfortunately I had jury duty that week. So I say unfortunately, but it also gave me the time to really think about this idea. And I was like, well, I've enjoyed reading people's written stories all over the internet, and they were kind of scattered about. But also a lot of them focused on just the tough bits, which are important to have in the story. But for me, it was like, I don't want people to just read the tough bits. I want them to read the tough bits and the determination in those tough bits, the insight, the recovery points as well. So I was like, right, let me create a website where people can post their stories, recovery-focused stories. And so we started there. The first 3 months was that. And then I was like, right, I want to do a podcast. This was in December 2015. And it wasn't ever to be anything big or to reach a lot of people. It was just, I want to interview therapists and other people with OCD because I enjoy having those conversations. And if it helps one or two people, then that's great. You know, so it's kind of the selfish element of I get to learn, and then hopefully it helps other people. And it's reached a few more than 2 people now. So I'm happy
Quite
with
a
that.
few more. Yeah, you're being modest. I think it is really the go-to podcast and resource for people to feel hope. And and I think stories are so good. And I love that you have a positive spin, because I think we really can frame mental health in a negative or a positive way. And you never listen to your podcast and feel down afterwards, you know, or feel like, wow, that was really heavy and depressing. There's an uplifting element to it. It's also super educational. I mean, you have amazing people that you've interviewed. Edna Foa. I mean, that's wildly impressive. You know? So you're like the Barbara Walters of OCD. You know, I don't know if you know who she is.
Same hairstyle.
Yeah. So I think it's educational, but also really inspiring and helpful, and a great tool for parents so that they don't get bogged down in the what ifs and the catastrophic thinking of, and where most parents go anyway, for sure. It leaves a positive note. So, all right, so I want to get into, and I know this is going to be hard for you, so we'll see. But if you had to think of like some of your best interviews, and you don't have to name who they were, but just like your biggest takeaways where you were interviewing someone, because there's just so much. I think you said even once that you like really your university was really like your podcast. I feel like I remember hearing you say that once, and I thought, yeah, I feel like it's very it's like reading a really big book of OCD. Like you learn, there's a takeaway from every guest. I've never listened to any episode of yours and didn't have like an aha moment, even as an OCD therapist myself and a mom and, you know, my own issues. I'm like, oh, that's an interesting way of looking at it. There's always something. But I wonder for you, what were your like top takeaways from some of the guests that you've had?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I don't remember saying that, but I whether I did or not, I agree with it.
Maybe you didn't.
It sounds smart. Maybe I said it. I don't know. Yeah, I think for me, like it's been, you know, I'm doing my master's now, and that's wonderful and it's teaching me an incredible amount. But on the topic of OCD, I don't think there's any masters out there that just focuses on OCD. Arguably, nor should there be. But you know, the podcast has taught me a lot, and thankfully, anyone that wants to listen to all 201 now, they too can get that same master's level education, so to speak. So yeah, in terms of there's been so many wonderful guests, like the story episodes I do, I interview people with OCD, or I've interviewed some parents. Those are always really touching. I always find they kind of move me. I always feel quite uplifted after them. And then I do a lot of clinician-based ones. So one of the earlier ones that really always stands out for me, and I get a bit of stick for this sometimes, it's just Reed Wilson's one. And because Reed Wilson talks about, he says the content of your worry is trash. And he's basically meaning with OCD, whether it's harm, contamination, religion, relationships, etc., that's not important. It's important to the sufferer, obviously, because that's the bit that's really torturing them and keeping them stuck. But in terms of treatment, it really doesn't matter. Like what matters is, I always look at it as there's OCD, and then all these different themes are just masks that kind of go over the OCD. And one week it's harm, next week it's relationships, etc. And it hasn't gone from relationship OCD to harm OCD to religious OCD. It's the same creature. It's just telling you a different story. And I think that's what he's getting at when he says that. And for me, for my own kind of recovery, but I think in others, you know, trying to detach from the themes, because the way I say it is, when people stay in the themes, they're playing OCD's game, and we're never going to beat OCD at that game because it's world class, you know.
Yeah.
It's the NBA champion of,
Right.
whereas we're not. Our sport is American football or cricket, for example. So we need to change the game, and that is tackling the process, the OCD, and not the mask or the theme. And I, as easy it is for me to say that now, I equally get how hard it is to try and ignore or let go of that theme, or not focus on it as much, because, you know, when you love your kid but you're having harmful thoughts about them, it's incredibly hard not to pay attention to those thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's work. I believe it's work we should be doing to try our best. And it's not something we're going to let go overnight, but kind of keep remembering it's about the process and OCD, not the mask or the theme.
Yeah. I wonder why you get pushback for that. Why do you think that?
It's because, well, it's when people who are, I guess they're quite severe at the time. For example, I don't know this, I'm just assuming, like they're really caught in the content of their thoughts, as Reed would say. So it does feel like unbelievably important. So I think that's why it's those people that usually have commented on YouTube or wherever else. And I understand, like I get it, and I don't push back on it.
Yeah.
But I think I know it's the people that, I can't say this entirely, but some of the people that do well, the people that know it's OCD, and they know it doesn't matter if it was religious or relationship or whatever, because they know it's still the same thing. The same as you hear, and I think I probably even said this years ago, of, you know, if I had religious OCD, it wouldn't bother me, because that's not a key concern for me. Or if it was, I'm trying to think of one I haven't had. contamination's never been huge for me. If I had contamination, it would never be a big issue for me. But that's not true, because if you have contamination OCD, it's a big issue for you.
Right.
It's not, it's the theme doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And then what else? Stephen Phillipson's always eye-opening, and he really, really gets it and gets his stuff. And he talked about choice on one of my episodes. And he also did like an audiobook version, which I published on the podcast. And that is, I think it's a good episode, even for people who don't have OCD or even mental health problems. I think this idea of choice, and he goes into it's like, I think it's like 40, he wrote it out as well. It's like 40 pages long, all on the importance of making choices and consciously making choices. So something I do in my own life now, kind of as a side note to OCD, because I think if OCD was full on, this wouldn't be as simple as I'm going to say it, but I just make a choice. So if I'm undecisive and I'm anxious on something, I'm not sure what to do, I just say, right, make a choice and then sit with it, live with it. If it's the wrong choice, at least you made a choice. So I'm putting the credit and the, I don't know, celebration on that I made a choice, even if it was the wrong choice. And the worst thing to do is not make a choice. So that has been a big shift for me personally. And I've had a few messages from others that have loved that idea of choice, making a choice. And then Dr. John Abramowitz is a good one. To be fair, he merges a lot of acceptance and commitment therapy with ERP, exposure and response prevention. So that's really fascinating. And he talks about willingness. And this is an ACT principle of how willing are you right now to do that exposure or to do this treatment. And I think that's an important thing for everyone generally to remember in treatment, is just willingness. Because if we're resisting and we're white knuckling it, we're not going to see as much progress as if we're kind of, it was Chris Tronsden who I interviewed in the last episode. He talks about going on the offense and not the defense. And I think in therapy, especially with something like ERP or behavior-based therapy, you need to be on the offense and going after OCD as opposed to waiting for it to come to us and then have to deal with it.
Yeah, these are all such good points, and such amazing people that you've interviewed too. And Reed Wilson, I love him because he's just so blunt and he just says it how it is. And I find that really refreshing. And these are all really good things for parents too. I mean, as a side note, I do feel like when you dive into OCD, it's just improving life, whether you have a mental health struggle or not. When you work on this stuff, you become better people, but you also become better parents. And so all these points that you're making, I feel like have a lot to do with the parent struggle too, because when we get into themes, I just want to go back to that really quick with Reed Wilson. I find, and I don't know if you find this as well, and you definitely will when you start working with parents clinically, like ad nauseum, but they get stuck in the themes too, just as much as the adult who's, struggling with OCD. And they'll say, oh, Natasha, I'm dealing with moral OCD. So does your class have just like a shortcut? Can we just go to the moral OCD part of your class? And I'm like, you're not understanding. Like, if you don't understand OCD in general, like the whole beast, it's going to change topics tomorrow. And then you're going to be like, oh, shoot. And so I think parents get stuck into that trap easily too, because we just want to simplify things. And so if I can just know the name of it, okay, my child, and you'll see this a lot on Facebook and support groups, my child has moral OCD, my child has contamination OCD. And like, it's like they're speaking different languages and they're not in the same team, And so I always try to say to people, it's the OCD buffet, you don't know what's on your child's plate. They might eat that and then they get another main dish, but the plate is the plate, so it helps. I think it helps as a therapist for me. This is my own little, whatever. I think it is helpful when I figure out their current subtype, so if I know, okay, this child has scrupulosity issues, then I can help the parents see where the child doesn't have a zillion problems. When they're saying, Mom, is it okay if I take this towel? Mom, is this okay if I eat this cookie? Mom, is it, and she's like, I don't know what is going on with that. And if we can put the umbrella of, she's got some scrupulosity issues right now, that's her current, main dish on her plate, then the parent's like, oh, it's the same thing. And so they can kind of spot it. But then I think they get stuck with these, like, almost like this identity of like, I'm on like I'm on moral OCD team. And it's like, no, because next week it's something else. And then they get overwhelmed because they're like you said, oh my gosh, my child has had like 5 OCD disorders. And you're like, nope, it's the same one. It's just ugly and it changes its face. So I like that. That was a really good point.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. I think, I was probably too like black and white. I agree. There's a certain amount that you still need the theme, because it does help you identify things quickly, and you can quickly find online. Okay, so moral scrupulosity. Oh, that's what some of the compulsions look like. Oh, that seems to be what's going on. And this is the type of ERP work that has been done historically with it. So it is, the theme's good for like finding ideas and stuff. And I will say, from a sufferer point of view, whether that's the parents or the teens or the adults, I won't say the kids because they shouldn't obviously be on social media till they're 13.
I laugh at you.
Yeah, I know.
I'm like, oh, silly
Shouldn't
man.
be on.
Right.
So for example, the term pure obsessional, which is obviously there are compulsions, but they're mental, or contamination OCD. So these kind of buzzwords and these, or even the short and abbreviation of ROCD, it helps people find each other online. And I think people can get I certainly did historically get a lot of comfort from, oh, this person has the same relationship worries as me. I'm not crazy, quote unquote. Like, so that is one big use I have for kind of the themes. It helps people find each other and get that support. But yeah, from a therapy point of view, I think they're useful initially, but then not to kind of stay too long in that place, and try and get to let's find the processes here and work on that.
Yeah. And then you started talking about that, about choice. And I learned a lot of stuff about ACT through you, listening to your podcast, because it just wasn't an ACT oriented therapist. I think I actually even heard the term from you. Isn't that sad? And I was like, what is, and then I was like, let me change that episode. That's just not speaking to me, and then, oh, he's talking about it again. Oh, he's talking about it again. And then it started to really resonate with me, as it really started to ooze into the OCD community. I think in the last few years, everyone's really embraced acceptance and commitment therapy. And then I started to realize, oh my gosh, this is so good. It's so important, because a lot of times, especially with kids, I'm always seeing things from just a child perspective, because that's all I work with, and my own kids. We're dragging them through ERP, and we don't pause to look at, are we empowering them to make a choice? Are we working on motivation? Are we tapping into what turns the dial for them? And I think that's just can be huge and can really change the perspective on treatment.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there are definitely some ERP or CBT therapists that will kind of say, we've been doing ACT-based stuff for decades, we just never called it these terms, and they're probably true, probably correct. So that I interview a lot of ERP therapists that don't use ACT, but when they talk, I could easily identify the things they're saying as, well, that's quite an ACT approach, or arguably it kind of already existed for them. And then there's a lot of ERP therapists that will have learned ACT as well, and they merge the two. And it's, as someone said on my podcast, it's two sides of the same coin. It's the ACT helps kind of the kid or the teenager with the ERP.
It does. And I feel like a really good ERP therapist is doing the things that are spoke about in ACT, but there is something to say about having some more intention. And so, for the last 2 decades, I was doing ACT oriented stuff just because intuitively it made sense for me to say to the child first, what's your biggest passion, just to get to know them. And then to say, and how's OCD ruining that for you? It's just intuitive. But then when you understand ACT, I put more focus on it. Like, I sit there more, and then I try to explain to parents too. Like, I think a lot of times parents want results very quickly. So there's like a dual pressure as a therapist, because you're trying to appease the child and make them feel good. And then you're also trying to help the parent see that you're not torturing their child. Like, there's a method to your madness. And a lot of times they want to push the child a little bit too fast because they're so desperate and overwhelmed. And they don't want you to sit there and talk about sports or horses or, like, what are you doing? So they have to understand it too.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I mean, your podcast does a good job at that, because I'll just be like, here's some really good, listen to this podcast, the OCD Stories, watch Unstuck, an OCD kids movie. Like there's some really good like anchoring tools that I like. So I appreciate that I can give them so they can go listen to it. And then all of a sudden they're like, okay, I totally get what you're doing, Natasha. I'm like, all right, thank you, Stu. That helps. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So do you have plans? Do you know where you're headed now that, well, actually I had two questions. Let me back up. Was your intention always to go into the mental health world, or did that happen naturally and organically?
Yeah, I can give you, go back to when I was sort of 15 I did a mock interview at school where they were preparing us for like interviews we'd have for the next stage of education and like part-time jobs and stuff like that. And I remember the guy, the businessman that sat me down and did this mock interview, and he asked me, what do you want to be when you're older? And I remember saying I wanted to be a psychologist. And I don't remember any time before that thinking I wanted to be a psychologist or anything like this. And bear in mind, at the time, the term psychologist meant only therapist for me, whereas now it could be researcher, it could be anything, not just a therapist, at least in the UK.
Yeah.
But I remember saying it so confidently and like it was a given, like that's what I wanted to be. Like there was nothing else. And anyway, I didn't get the grades at school. Our high school finishes at 16. It's just terminology. And then 17, 18 is our, what we call college or sixth form before you go on to university at 18. So those 2 years, which I believe is your high school, I struggled. I didn't get the grades to do psychology or sociology. And I remember the teacher saying, if we put you on these courses, you're going to struggle. So we don't think it's, I now know, let me struggle, because when I've struggled in life, it's when I've done my best work.
Right.
It's when things are easy, I get bored and don't try. And anyway, so I did A-levels, which is that 16, 17 age, struggled again, somehow got on uni, did media studies, then marketing, and had a good 9-10 year career in marketing. But the last sort of 3 years since the start of the podcast, I've been retraining to be a therapist. So I had to do a 1 year master's conversion course into psychology, which I did. And now I'm actually on my 3 year training to be a therapist.
Well, that's exciting. So it was in the cards the whole time.
I believe so, yeah. But it was my own, it was finally facing my own struggle that I started, before I did the OCD Stories, I started blogging on my own personal site, which isn't active now. But that was kind of really the start of it all. Of I kind of, it's never too late to go back and start again, and that's where I'm at now.
Yeah, I think that's exciting. I feel like you've already had your education by the best, but that's okay. We have to go through these formal,
That's true.
and because they don't really spend a lot of, this is my humble opinion, they don't spend enough time in graduate school on OCD. You take the initiative and really get your own training to know what you're doing. So what's your plan? This is where I was going. I wanted to know, do you have like an idea of what your big vision is?
Long term, it will be circle back to OCD and anxiety, specifically with kids and teens. So I guess similar to what you're doing. At the minute in my training, it's more general and broad. So I'm working with elementary age kids now, and it could be anything that kind of the symptoms. So as far as I'm aware, I haven't come across OCD yet.
Well, you would know. I think you would definitely know. So do you have an age that you like the most, like an age range that you like working with?
Yeah, so the two age ranges I've worked with so far is college age kids, which is our 16, 17-year-olds. And I'm now working with 5 to 11-year-olds. Well, no, 4 to 11-year-olds, sorry. So I haven't done that sort of 12 to 16 yet, or 15. That will be next year. So at the minute, I really enjoyed the 16, 17-year-olds because they're a very important, in my opinion, an important time in their life if they've got to start making some big decisions, education-wise or career-wise. And as all teens, they're trying to break away from their parents. The parents are still trying to pull them back in, understandably. There's that fight for independence, which I find fascinating. But I don't know, I do really enjoy the young kids. I think there's just something very, I use the word innocent, but they're I think they're also quite determined to like be engaged in treatment, and I think that's really good.
Yeah, it's so funny because they're so different, and treatment looks so different depending on what age you're dealing with. And those three ages, the way they broke them out, like I feel like those are the good boxes, because when you're doing OCD treatment or anxiety treatment with a 5-year-old, it's completely different. Because I love doing cognitive behavioral therapy with a 5-year-old, because they'll just wrap your brain around. They're just like, people don't think they can do cognitive behavioral therapy with a 5-year-old, and it's like, of course you can. You just have to know how to speak to them. They're brilliant people, but it's totally different than the 16-year-old who's been suffering for 10 years. And on some level, that's almost, to me, this is obviously my opinion, it's more instantly rewarding, because you give them a name for something they didn't know there was, and you normalize things, and just the relief on their face. The
Yeah.
5-year-old is rewarding because you're planting seeds, and so nobody else knows, but that you're preventing all of this long-term struggle for a child. So it's internally, privately rewarding, but you're not going to get like a big thank you so much. I mean,
Yeah.
not for a 5-year-old.
I get
16-year-old,
it.
you're either going to get like an eye roll and a cancellation, or you're going to get a lot of thank yous. So it just
Yeah.
depends.
Yeah,
It's
that's
funny.
been my experience.
Yeah, it's fun. I'm glad you're going to work with kids. It's my
Thank
bias.
you.
We need
Well,
more.
yeah, that's as I say, the partly why I did that was originally I didn't have a more of an affiliation with kids and teens than I did with adults, because for me, I was just interested in helping people who are suffering. And I probably will eventually do a small amount of work with adults just to get that variety. But it's the reason I want to work with kids specifically and teens is I wanted to kind of be that intervention that I wanted as a 7-year-old, or that
Yeah.
I needed as a 7-year-old. Um, so that there's that's what really drives me. And now I actually, because I wasn't sure how I would get on with the kids, and actually I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah, I think you either love it or you hate it. I think working with kids, it's really, there's no gray. It's just, it either resonates with you or it doesn't.
Yeah,
And yeah, I think it's really rewarding too. You do work with adults, you just don't realize it because you're working with the parents,
that's true.
and
Yeah,
the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So I find that a lot of the parents will really enjoy the therapy, because I normally have them in the room together depending on the issue, but the parent is improving along with the child, and that's very cool to see, because it's almost like um, by osmosis. They're just sitting there and they're just, oh, I could do that. And the best is when you work with dads who are like very, very dad-like, and they're like old school dads who are like barely even there. They're like rolling their eyes, and their wife has dragged them in, and they're the ones genetically with the OCD. And I'll just see these dads who are like, I'll take her to her next appointment. I'll sit in, and then
yeah,
they'll talk to their daughter, and, oh, I do this too. And, well, I tapped when I was your age. And that's
mm,
just the coolest thing when you see that transformation in the dad. So
yeah.
you
That's
never know
awesome.
who's your identified client. So I want to touch on one more thing before we wrap up. You also have a camp. I don't know if that's something you're going to continue.
It is. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, then I want to talk about that, because, well, there's two things I want to talk about, and maybe they're smushed together. One, I have a lot of UK listeners, whether it's on my podcast or my YouTube channel or just in my Facebook group, and they really struggle. And it's not just the UK. There's people in small towns in America, and I have a lot of South Africans. I'm trying to think of the main countries that are a problem: Canada, South Africa, Australia, and the UK. Like, those are the four. Maybe that's just because they're not blocked on my IP address, so like they're coming through, but they're having a hard time accessing help. In the UK, if you had a parent who was struggling, because I have quite a few of them in my community, what would you advise them to do? Because they get stuck, they get turned away, they get no help.
Yeah. So this is the kid has, for example, the OCD, but the parents trying to get the help. Yeah. So we do have private therapy in the UK. So if that's an option, then my best advice to that is contact. We have two OCD charities. One is OCD Action, and the other one is OCD UK. I'm sure OCD UK know this as well, but I'm pretty sure OCD Action have a list of kind of recommended private therapists for OCD. So there's that, kind of call them up. They have a call line, a support line, and they can talk you through it.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah, on that same, both the charities have call lines actually, which is really good. which is a good place just to get general support as well.
Yeah.
Um, but on that same call, they can talk you through the process of getting the right help with the NHS. So, reading between the lines, the people that are emailing you, I'm assuming that they've gone to the NHS either through the GP or we have a system called IAPT, which is improving access to psychological therapies, where you can self-refer. Now, I'm not sure how it works with children, but I'm sure the parents can do it. But if not, through the GP. But the reason I'm saying I reckon they've already done it is because that's our kind of national healthcare, and it's free to get that treatment. But depending on where you are in the country, if you're in the real southwest, the real tip where you're quite far, I don't want to say from civilization, but from a big town, the chances of having an OCD therapist there, a CBT therapist, is less likely than in London, where you've got 8 million people and there's going to be a lot of OCD or CBT therapists. So in which case, I'd say speak to one of the charities and they can tell you about your rights, because there's various ways of, like, even if there's none in your area, how you can get funding on the NHS to get. So I know some people have got the NHS to pay for private therapists. And there's lots of ways, but the best thing is just use the resources of the OCD charities, because they fight for people's rights all the time. And sometimes they can write letters for you on your behalf to give to your GP or your doctor or whoever's deciding who gets treatment and who doesn't. And they can go through all of that. So that's probably the simplest way.
Okay. That's really good to know. Yeah, that's really helpful. Okay, let's talk about your camp, because this is exciting. I know there's one that happens in the States that I think that's not for kids. I don't think that one's for kids.
With the one in the States, in Seattle, that is odd and even years. I can't remember which is which, but let's say even years is so like 2020 is adults and 2019 is, I think it's teens, not children.
Okay.
I think that's probably more for health and safety reasons.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you have one in the UK. So let's talk about your camp.
I do. So just to give credit to the person I was just talking about, Pete Weiss in Seattle. He's a therapist, OCD therapist. Him and Travis is the other therapist that runs it with him. But Pete came over to the UK and he showed me the ropes. He ran the first camp with me, taught me everything he knew. So I'm incredibly grateful to him. But yeah, so the idea is it's 3 days and it's just adults at the minute. Eventually, I think when I'm qualified, I will then do teens and probably children. And I want to do with the children, I want to do it with the parents. It's kind of extra help for me because they can help, work with their child. But also, it's that, as you were saying, it's the bonding. I want the daughter and the dad, or the son and the mum, to bond over that weekend. So but at a minute, it's just for adults because it's easier, and I enjoy it. But it's 3 days, and it's not really a therapy camp in the sense of we're not trying to do exposures or anything like that. It's more 8 people, so 8 people with OCD getting to meet, getting to talk, sharing their story. There's lots of like skills-based activities, so being quite mindful, whether that's matchless firelighting or making like survival-based rope things. We all cook together. We cook on the open fire. Then both nights we're sitting around the campfire, either telling their kind of OCD story, or we do other exercises all based around sort of compassion and building up some self-esteem. And by the end of it, where these people were quite shy initially, you can't stop them talking on that final day. So it's and for some people, it's the first time they've ever met anyone with OCD, and now they've met 8 people and for 48 hours done nothing but talk about OCD. So it's. I said to someone the other day, it's the most rewarding thing I think I've ever done in my life, and I've only done it. I've only done it twice now, so the third year's next year. I'd love to do it more, but there's a lot of planning involved and time.
Oh, I bet. It sounds like it would be a lot to orchestrate. And it is like completely therapeutic. So even if you're not working on doing exposures, just that community, building that empowerment and feeling like you're not alone, like that's the foundation of everything. So that's neat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, hopefully you'll do it with kids.
I definitely want to. there's there's a camp. I saw a podcast on it. I don't know if you listened to it. I think it's called Fear Chasers or something like that. I'll send you a link afterwards, and maybe you can put it in the show notes of this episode. But I think that's like a 2-week summer camp in the States, and it's run
Somebody
by
said that to me too.
yeah. I think it's run by a university in the States or an OCD clinic. But yeah, it seems quite good, and it's aimed at young kids, and there's loads of activities. And but I'll dig out the link and I'll send it to you.
Yeah, if you can, I'll include that. I feel like somebody shared that with me, and I was just like, "What is that?" And I was so busy, and I like just looked at it for a second because I get a lot of people sending me stuff, and a lot of it isn't really good quality. And I was like, "Fear Chasers, what is that? That's so cool." And then someone called, and I lost it, and I never went back. But I think it was probably what you're talking about, which it would be nice to look back, because I think these intense uplifting programs would be really helpful for kids, and it's a nice middle option from, like, we really don't have a lot of choices. It's like, and we want our kids to not feel like they're alone. I mean, I'd love to send my child to that. I mean, I brought them to the OCD conference for the first time last summer because they just were not well enough, and they were young enough, and they just lit up. They couldn't stop talking about it for like 2 weeks afterwards. And my son, who's normally pretty quiet and embarrassed about his OCD, he was just educating everybody, and he was talking about, and he even wore his shirt. Like, I bought him a couple of shirts from, trying to think, he wore the OCD, like unstuck shirt to school. Okay. And I was like, if you wear this, people are going to ask you what it is. Are you okay? And he's like, oh, Mom, I'm okay telling them. Like, he was such a different kid. So I think there is power in getting our kids to realize they're not alone.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm going to ask you one last question. So you ask everybody at the end of your shows, if there was a billboard, and they could put anything on it, what would they say? And I always am like, what would he say? What would his answer be? So in the spirit of me turning the mic on you for this entire episode, I thought we could end with that.
Oh, man.
You never thought about your answer?
No, do you know what? I think I've given an answer before, but for me, it changes all the time.
Yeah.
The first thing that came to me was do something that matters.
I like that.
And I'll unpack that because it can almost sound quite arrogant, I think. Do something that matters to you is the longer version of it. Find something that, I don't want to say that makes your heart sing, or necessarily something cliche like that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a career or a job. Just try and find at some point in your week doing something that really lifts you up and matters to you, whether that's going for a walk in the woods, spending some time with a friend, even if it's on the phone, that you really just feel alive after speaking to them. Or it could be something like volunteering, or it could be changing your career path, or whatever it is. Just find something each week that really matters to you and do it.
I think that's good advice, because, surprisingly, a lot of people aren't doing that. So that would be good. Well, everybody can find you at the OCD Stories on, I guess, iTunes or Apple or Stitcher. And it's the OCD Stories. Is it the OCDstories.com?
The OCDstories.com, or just the OCD Stories in Google, and hopefully everything should come up.
It does. And I will leave links just in case someone's lazy and they want to just click it. So thank you so much for coming on. It was so nice talking to you.
No, you too. Thanks for the opportunity.